Biker's target, a blind veteran's daughter, until she makes one call that changes everything. The wheels of the old Buick crunched against the gravel as it pulled into the parking lot of the Blue Jay Diner, a small roadside spot just off Route 41 in Indiana. The kind of place that hadn't changed much since the 1950s. Red vinyl booths, faded Coca-Cola signs, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't played a song in years. Inside, the air carried the familiar scent of bacon grease and freshly brewed coffee. A couple of truckers sat hunched over their plates at the counter. A waitress refilled a man's mug without asking, and an elderly couple whispered across from each other in a corner booth. It was the kind of morning where no one was in a rush, except for the group of bikers near the window, who had been there long enough to leave a mess of empty plates and spilled ketchup across their table. The bell above the door jingled as Lorraine stepped inside, guiding her father by the arm. She was 24, tall, with a quiet strength in her posture that came from years of being his eyes in a world that wasn't always kind. Her father, Daniel Briggs, walked carefully beside her, his grip firm but trusting. He had lost his sight 6 years ago. Afghanistan, an IED blast that took more than just his vision. But he never let it make him smaller. He still carried himself like a Marine, head held high, shoulders squared, despite the cane that tapped lightly against the floor as he moved. "Right here, Dad," Lorraine said, steering him toward an open booth near the jukebox. He nodded, feeling for the edge of the seat before lowering himself down. Lorraine slid in across from him and picked up the menu, though they didn't need it. They had been here before, and he always ordered the same thing: black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, and a side of bacon. She preferred pancakes, drowning them in syrup until they barely resembled food. "Smells busy today," Daniel muttered, tilting his head slightly, listening. She glanced around. A few tables, nothing crazy. He smiled, like he always did when she tried to smooth things over for him. He could hear the clatter of dishes, the scrape of a fork against a plate, the low hum of conversation. He didn't need eyes to read a room. A waitress approached, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a kind smile. "Well, if it isn't my favorite pair." "Usual?" "Please," Lorraine said, handing back the menus. The waitress scribbled on her notepad and poured Daniel's coffee before stepping away. Across the diner, the bikers' conversation grew louder. Deep, rumbling voices, the occasional burst of laughter that seemed a little too forced. Lorraine didn't think much of it at first. Bikers passed through all the time, stopping for a meal before heading back out onto the road. Some were polite, some weren't. But something about this group felt different. She could feel it before she could hear it. A shift in the air, the way people at nearby tables suddenly seemed more interested in their food than the room around them. A waitress hesitated before approaching their table, then turned back toward the kitchen. It wasn't fear exactly, just an unwillingness to engage. That's when she heard the first remark. "Look at this one," a voice snickered. "Got herself a seeing-eye daughter." Lorraine stiffened. Daniel kept stirring his coffee, his face unreadable. Another voice chimed in. "Ain't that sweet? Bet she even ties his shoes for him." Lorraine's hands clenched under the table, but she didn't react, not yet. The tension in the air was thick, but for now she held her tongue. That wouldn't last for long. Lorraine focused on the coffee in front of her, willing herself to ignore the voices coming from across the diner. The last thing she wanted was to cause a scene, especially not with her father sitting right there. But the laughter, the kind that wasn't just amusement, but cruelty disguised as humor, continued. One of the bikers, a man with a thick beard and a sleeveless leather vest, leaned back in his chair. His boots were propped up against the empty chair across from him, and his beer bottle, probably his 3rd or 4th, dangled lazily from his fingers. He tilted his head toward his friend, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "She guiding him or walking him around like a lost puppy?" Laughter erupted at the table. A few heads turned, but no one said anything. The waitress at the counter hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line before she busied herself wiping an already clean surface. Lorraine could see it in their faces. No one wanted trouble. Not with a group like this. Daniel, however, remained completely still. He took a slow sip of his coffee, setting the mug down with steady precision. If the words bothered him, he didn't show it. That was the thing about her father. He had faced worse. He had lived through worse. But Lorraine wasn't as patient. Her jaw tightened, and she exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to stay calm. She reached for the syrup, drizzling it over her pancakes, moving carefully as if that would stop the heat rising in her chest. The bikers weren't done. "Bet she even has to cut his steak for him," another voice chimed in. "Damn shame, huh? Tough guy like that, reduced to a damn charity case." Something inside Lorraine snapped. Before she could stop herself, her fork clattered against the plate, and she turned her head just enough to meet the biker's gaze. He was grinning, his teeth yellowed from too many cigarettes. His arms were covered in faded tattoos, and the way he leaned forward, elbow propped on the table, made it clear he wasn't expecting her to respond. But she did. "You done?" she asked, her voice calm, steady. The grin widened. "Oh, she talks. What, sweetheart? You upset? Just making conversation." "Yeah?" Lorraine tilted her head slightly. "Well, here's some conversation for you. Shut your mouth." The laughter at the table faltered, just for a second. One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy with a patchy beard, let out a low whistle. Feisty one. Daniel finally spoke. "Lorraine." His tone was quiet but firm. She clenched her fists under the table. She knew that tone, knew what it meant. Let it go. Don't waste your breath. But then the first biker, the loudest one, laughed again, shaking his head. "Man, look at that. Raised a little guard dog." That was it. Lorraine pulled out her phone. The bikers chuckled. "Oh, what now?" one of them sneered. "Calling the cops?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She just pressed one number and put the phone to her ear, and suddenly the room started paying attention. The bikers were still laughing, but something was different now. They had no idea what was coming. Lorraine held the phone to her ear, her expression unreadable. She didn't raise her voice, didn't look angry, didn't even acknowledge the bikers anymore. She just listened to the ringing on the other end. The lead biker, the one with the thick beard and stained teeth, leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Oh no," he mocked. "She's serious. What's it going to be, sweetheart? You calling the sheriff? Maybe your boyfriend? You think that's going to scare us?" Lorraine didn't react. She just waited. The other end of the line clicked. A voice answered, deep and familiar. She spoke calmly. "Hey, it's me. I need a favor." She barely got the words out before the lead biker erupted in laughter. "Oh, this is Rich," he said, nudging the guy next to him. "She's got a call for backup. You hear that, boys? Someone's coming to save her." His amusement spread through the table. One of them let out a dramatic sigh. "Better eat fast before we get ourselves into some real trouble." But the energy in the diner had shifted. It wasn't just Lorraine and the bikers anymore. Other people had stopped eating, their gazes flicking between the group and Lorraine, their interest piqued by something other than idle curiosity. The waitress near the counter shot a glance toward the clock on the wall, as if she knew something was about to happen. Daniel, still sitting quietly, reached for his coffee again. "Lorraine," he said, his voice calm. "What are you doing?" She hung up the phone, slipped it back into her pocket. Then she met her father's gaze. Not that he could see it, but somehow he always knew when she was looking at him. "I'm handling it," she said simply. The lead biker scoffed. "You're handling it," he repeated, shaking his head. "Girl, you don't know what kind of game you're playing." Lorraine didn't answer. She reached for her fork, cut into her pancakes and took a bite. That threw them off. The laughter quieted just a little, replaced with something else. Confusion, annoyance, maybe even something closer to unease, though none of them would ever admit it. For the first time, the lead biker wasn't sure if he was in control of this conversation anymore. He straightened, rubbing a hand over his beard. "You don't just get to—" The bell over the diner door jingled. The bikers barely noticed, too focused on their performance to pay attention to another customer walking in. But then another walked in, and another. One by one, men and women started to fill the space near the entrance. Some were in uniform, others weren't. Some wore old jackets, faded but well kept, with patches stitched onto the sleeves. A few were younger, but most were older, men in their 50s, 60s, even 70s. And every single one of them carried the same look. Steady. Cold. Not angry, but not amused either. The waitress at the counter let out a slow breath. The lead biker frowned, his confidence wavering for the first time. He glanced at the newcomers, then back at Lorraine. She just took another bite of her food. That was when he realized these people weren't just random customers. They were here for a reason. The laughter at the table had stopped entirely. Now, for the first time, the bikers weren't so sure they wanted to be there anymore. The diner had changed. Just a few moments ago, it had been the bikers' stage. Their voices had carried, their laughter had been the loudest sound in the room. But now there was something heavier in the air, something they couldn't quite place, but felt deep in their bones. The men and women who had walked in weren't just here for breakfast. They moved with quiet precision, spreading out just enough to be noticeable, but not chaotic. A man with silver hair and a well-pressed Marine Corps jacket took a seat at the counter, nodding at the waitress as if this was just another Tuesday morning. Another, a woman in her 60s, with short cropped hair and a navy patch on her sleeve, leaned against the wall near the jukebox. They weren't looking at the bikers. They were looking at Daniel. The lead biker's smirk wavered. His eyes darted between the new arrivals, his fingers tapping against the table as if he could drum away the shift in control. He wasn't laughing anymore. One of the newcomers, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his hands rough and weathered, stepped forward. He wore a simple button-down, but the scars on his knuckles and the way he carried himself told a different story. He stopped beside Daniel's booth, his gaze settling on the older man with a quiet kind of respect. "Briggs," he said. Daniel lifted his chin slightly. "Carter." Lorraine watched as the lead biker's confidence slipped another notch. Carter. That name alone meant something. She had heard her father mention him before, back when she was younger, back before everything changed. They had served together, fought in the same battles, lost friends in the same deserts. And now, he was here. For him. The lead biker cleared his throat, sitting up straighter in his seat. "What's all this?" he asked, forcing out a chuckle. "Some kind of reunion?" Carter turned his head, finally acknowledging the man for the first time. His expression didn't change, but something about the way he looked at him made the entire table shift uncomfortably. "Something like that," Carter said, his voice even. The younger biker, the one with the patchy beard, leaned forward, trying to regain some of the bravado that had slipped through their fingers. "Look, man, we were just messing around," he said. "Didn't mean anything by it." Carter didn't respond right away. He just studied the group, his gaze slow and deliberate. "You think it's funny?" he asked finally. The lead biker forced a smirk. "It was just talk." Carter tilted his head slightly. "You ever been shot at?" The question was so abrupt, so casual, that it sucked all the air out of the room. The biker hesitated. "What? You heard me." Carter didn't blink. "You ever sat in the sand with bullets kicking up dust next to your head? Ever held a friend while he bled out? Ever felt the ground shake under your feet and prayed to God you'd make it home?" The lead biker's mouth opened, then closed. Carter leaned in slightly. "No," he said. "Then maybe, just maybe, you should keep your mouth shut about things you don't understand." Silence. The entire diner was still. Even the waitress had stopped moving, her coffee pot frozen mid-pour. Lorraine watched the lead biker's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed. He wasn't used to this. He was used to pushing people around, being the loudest voice in the room. But now, he wasn't sure what kind of room he had walked into, and he was just starting to realize he had made a mistake. The bikers had started the morning in control. Now they were just hoping to make it out without losing more than their pride. The lead biker sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table like it might keep him steady. His boys, who had been so full of laughter minutes ago, weren't making a sound. They weren't reaching for their drinks. They weren't cracking jokes. They were waiting, watching, to see how this would play out. Carter didn't move, didn't break eye contact. He didn't have to. Lorraine had seen this before, not with Carter, but with her father. The way certain men carried themselves, the way they didn't have to raise their voices to command a room. It wasn't about size or strength. It was about presence. And right now, Carter had all of it. The lead biker swallowed hard. "Look, man," he said, voice quieter than before. "We didn't know." Carter blinked. "Didn't know what?" The biker hesitated. "Didn't know he was blind," Carter pressed, his tone still calm. "Didn't know she was his daughter. Didn't know you were running your mouth about a man who put his life on the line so you could sit here and eat your damn eggs in peace." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel finally shifted in his seat, setting his coffee down with a quiet clink. "It's fine," he said, voice even. "They're just boys who don't understand what respect looks like." That hit harder than any insult. Lorraine saw it in the way the biker flinched, his face twisting like he wasn't sure if he should be angry or ashamed. Carter exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. "Respect," he repeated. He gestured toward Daniel with a slight nod. "That man has it. You don't." The younger biker, the one who had been so eager to laugh before, shifted uncomfortably. "All right, man," he muttered. "We get it." But Carter wasn't done. He straightened, adjusting his jacket, then turned to the lead biker one last time. "You think you're tough because you roll into places like this? Act like you own the room." He shook his head. "You don't even know what tough looks like." The lead biker didn't answer. He just clenched his jaw, reached for his wallet, and tossed a few crumpled bills onto the table. "We were leaving anyway." Carter smirked, just barely. "Yeah," he said. "I bet you were." The bikers pushed back their chairs, standing one by one. The younger one walked out first, practically tripping over his own feet in his rush to leave. The lead biker lingered for just a second longer, glancing toward Daniel before shaking his head and following the others outside. The bell above the door jingled as they left. And just like that, the diner breathed again. The waitress let out a long sigh, muttering, "About damn time," before picking up a coffee pot and heading toward another table like nothing had happened. A trucker at the counter shook his head, turning back to his food. Carter finally slid into the booth across from Daniel, resting his forearms on the table. "You all right, old man?" Daniel smirked. "Been called worse?" Lorraine relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever, exhaling as she leaned back in her seat. Carter turned to her, nodding slightly. "Smart call." She just shrugged. "I knew they'd listen to you." He chuckled. "You give me too much credit." They just weren't ready to deal with real men. Daniel lifted his coffee again, shaking his head. "Real men don't need to prove anything." Carter grinned. "Now that," he said, "is respect." The bikers had left the diner thinking they'd walked away. But they knew, deep down, they hadn't won anything. The low rumble of motorcycles faded into the distance, swallowed by the quiet hum of the highway. Inside the diner, things slowly returned to normal. Plates clinked, coffee poured, and conversations resumed, though with an air of shared understanding. Lorraine let out a slow breath, her hands finally unclenching beneath the table. She hadn't realized how tight her fists had been. She glanced at her father, who was still sipping his coffee like nothing had happened. He always had a way of staying steady, even when everything around him felt like it was about to tip over. Carter leaned back in the booth, stretching his arms across the seat. "So," he said, looking at Daniel, "you always let your daughter handle your fights for you now?" Daniel smirked. "Seems like she did just fine." Lorraine rolled her eyes but smiled. "I figured I'd save you the trouble." Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "She's got your fire, that's for damn sure." Daniel nodded slightly. "She's had to." For a moment the table went quiet. Not the kind of awkward silence that needed to be filled, but the kind that carried weight, understanding. Then Carter's expression turned a little more serious. He rested his elbows on the table, his fingers laced together. "You know, it never fails to amaze me," he said, "how loud cowards can be." Lorraine glanced toward the door where the bikers had left. "You think they'll be back?" Carter snorted. "Not a chance. They were all bark. The second they realized they weren't the biggest dogs in the room, they ran with their tails between their legs." Daniel set his coffee down. "It's not just them," he said. "There's always going to be people like that. People who think respect is something you demand instead of something you earn." Carter nodded. "Yeah. But every now and then they meet someone who reminds them otherwise." Lorraine thought about that. About how different the outcome could have been. About how her father had spent his life fighting for a country that didn't always fight for him in return. And yet, He never let it make him bitter. Never let it turn him into the kind of person who threw his weight around just to feel strong. Strength wasn't about that. Strength was in restraint, in knowing when to stand, when to fight, and when to let the lesson speak for itself. The waitress walked by and set the check on the table, but before Lorraine could reach for it, Carter slid it toward himself. "Don't even think about it," he said, pulling out his wallet. Daniel chuckled. "Still trying to pay off an old debt?" Carter grinned. "Something like that." As the waitress walked away, Lorraine glanced at her father. "You ready to go?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, listening. Then he nodded. "Yeah, let's get out of here." Carter stood first, holding out a hand to Daniel. Daniel reached forward, finding Carter's grip with practiced ease. It was a handshake, but not just any handshake. It was one that carried years of history. Brotherhood that time and distance couldn't erase. Lorraine stepped beside her father, gently touching his arm. He turned slightly toward her, his unspoken way of saying he was ready. As they walked toward the door, Carter called after them. "Hey, Lorraine." She turned back. He nodded toward her father. "You take care of that old man." She smirked. "Always." The bell jingled as they stepped outside. The air was cooler now, the sun a little lower in the sky. Lorraine led her father toward the car, her grip steady on his arm. Daniel inhaled deeply, letting the moment settle. "You did good today," he said quietly. Lorraine smiled. "I learned from the best." He turned his head toward her, a slow grin forming on his face. "That's the only compliment I'm getting today, isn't it?" She laughed, shaking her head as she opened the car door for him. "Pretty much." As they pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the diner and its morning behind, Lorraine glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The lesson had been given. The respect had been restored. And those men, the ones who had thought power was in their numbers, in their volume, in their ability to mock, had learned something today. Real strength doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be real. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. Those who truly know what it means to be strong never have to prove it to anyone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.